So I'm very happy to present this research, which is seeking to understand mixed income housing, and also to provide a conceptual framework for explaining variation in outcomes that we find from mixed income housing projects. And I do want to make a few acknowledgments. I'd like to thank Mark Joseph for some very helpful discussions that stimulated my thinking on this topic and helped prompt me write this paper. And also to thank Sasha for organizing the symposium and providing an opportunity to share the work. And then also to Larry Vail for his guidance and support. I think I might just switch over here to this one. So what I want to do is pick up on some of the themes that I think that Sean and Tim mentioned regarding the importance of people when we're thinking about mixed income housing, and bring that to the forefront, I think, through this framework. So what I'd like to do is I'll give you a little bit of a preview of, or sort of the punchline of the talk today. What I'll start is to talk about the motivation and importance of thinking about mixed income housing. Much of this has to do with its widespread support and appeal across many countries and across different levels of government. Further, I'll briefly review some of the theory and empirical work around mixed income housing, in particular the theorized benefits for low-income households for living in mixed income housing developments, and then the empirical results that we've seen both in the US and in other countries. And what we find is there's a pretty big gap between what we expect is going to happen and what we see on the ground. Now this gap raises a number of questions, and the one that I want to focus on is, what does mixed income housing mean? I think what this suggests, in part, is that we either lack understanding of what mixed income housing is all about, or perhaps at the very least, when we talk about mixed income housing, we're actually talking about very different things, and we're not talking about the same term. So another way of thinking about this is that we have quite a bit of information on individual mixed income housing projects, but we don't know how those projects fit together. And so what I hope to do with this framework is to provide a way of thinking about those projects in a unified and consistent fashion. The shorthand for the framework is who is mixed where. It takes into account households, the moving process, the project level characteristics, as well as the neighborhood context. Does that seem to be? Right? But it doesn't seem to be it actually doesn't seem to be advancing. So as I mentioned, the framework takes those project-level characteristics and puts them within the context of neighborhoods, but also considers households and the individual moves. This framework has a few important implications, one in terms of thinking about the outcomes that we see, but also helps us organize different policy approaches to creating mixed income housing.
Do you have your stick with you, Steve?
I do.
Seems to have frozen up again. Thank you.
If I could ask, so you said there were three. Who was mixed where as part of the framework?
Who is mixed where? So yeah, so who is mixed where? So households, so the level of individual households, the people that we're interested in.
Is the second one?
That's the primary element.
Yeah.
The second one is that mixed income housing typically involves some sort of move, and that's a dynamic process that we don't often think about. They move into some type of project. This is a series of project-level characteristics, which I've looked at in previous work. But then there's a larger neighborhood context in which that they reside, and that's the fourth part of it. So in terms of the popularity of mixed income housing, what we see is that this approach is widely used in many countries around the world. So not just in Canada and the United States, but also in the United Kingdom and in Australia and other places. Here you can imagine that there's a map where I have I've actually mapped this. The OECD has been very interested in this and has actually started recording information on their term is social rental housing. And what we find is that North America and much of Europe is covered by this, is covered by programs that are looking at mixed income housing or social rental housing. But we also see it in places like Japan and South Korea. This one housing scholar has noted is an amazing example of international policy transfer. It's pretty unusual for something, an approach to housing to be used in so many different countries around the world. I should also note, I should also note that mixed income housing is approached at all levels of government. So in the United States context, the federal government has been a primary player, as Joni mentioned, through the Hope 6 program, Housing Opportunities for People Everywhere. This was a $6 billion federal program that started in the 1990s and was designed to redevelop deteriorating public housing complexes in cities across the country. But mixed income housing is also pursued at the state and the city level. And again, Joni's presentation highlighted in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, we see city governments taking this initiative. Another point to make is that mixed income housing is not only popular, but it has wide support. Elected officials in government have come out in favor of mixed income housing as a form of neighborhood revitalization. We find that housing organizations and advocacy groups are also very supportive of this kind of approach. Even private developers and investors speak favorably about mixed income housing, and residents themselves as well. Now, I'm going to pause here for a moment to recognize how rare it is that the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit or non-governmental sector can all agree on something, let alone be excited about it. Right? Now, critics will certainly suggest that governments are interested in mixed income housing because in some ways they can, at least in the US, they can shift the cost and burden of producing housing to the private sector. Private developers and investors might be supportive because they found it to be a profitable way of pursuing it. And nonprofit organizations are supportive because at least someone is doing something about this housing problem. Right? Okay, we're getting there. So we'll go from there, from the popularity and the support, to starting to think about the theory and literature around mixed income housing. And this gets at a sort of a scholarly perspective on why we build mixed income housing. And this relates to the theorized benefits. So Mark Joseph and Rob Chaskin have done a lot of work on this topic. And they find there's sort of four sort of general areas of benefits that are theorized according to the literature that low-income households will benefit from. The first stems from increased social capital. Right? And this is the idea that we can put in concrete terms that by bringing in high-income households to live with low-income households, they may receive more information about things like employment opportunities or leads on jobs. Other ideas like, thank you very much. We're just gonna, let's just test this. Okay, so we'll speed ahead through all of this. There's our map, which you imagined earlier. Very popular, we know all this now. Widespread support, highly unusual, right? And so now we'll return to the theorized benefits. So increased social capital, as I mentioned, refers to things like leads on jobs. We might also think about educational opportunities or even other resources like childcare. Another theorized benefit has to do with role modeling of social norms. This gets at the idea that, or the assumption that if low-income households see higher-income households going to work on a regular basis, or cleaning up in their, around their homes, that somehow low-income households who may not hold these norms will somehow adopt them. I think you can note that this is clearly very fraught. A third benefit has to do with these informal social control. We can think of this in some ways as sort of a notion of eyes on the street, but also that higher income residents may take greater concern and care about their surroundings. And this might include things like being concerned about crime or other issues that contribute to community safety. And finally, broader community gains that may occur through bringing in high-income residents. And this has to do with increased engagement with elected officials and political support, but also with private businesses in demanding higher quality services. Now, as I mentioned, many of these theorized benefits are somewhat controversial, but I think it's important to go to the empirical work to try to test this. What we find is that the results are somewhat mixed. In the Australia context, Arthurson notes that mixed income development is not a requirement for cohesive communities because he finds evidence of strong community cohesion that existed prior to the mixed income development. In other parts, in other case studies, we note that the public housing residents report feeling being stigma or ostracized as a result of the mixed income development, in part through differential treatment from higher income households. But of course, this is not just the case in Australia. In Toronto, public housing residents lament the loss of social ties and community networks that were in their previously existing public housing community, and also report some uneasy and uncomfortable social interactions with their higher income neighbors. In the mixed tenure context, in Scotland, we find, contrary to the theorized benefits about social capital, very little evidence of any improvements in those social networks. And now, coming to the US, focusing specifically on Chicago, Chaskin and Joseph find that public housing residents are generally very satisfied and pleased with the improvements in housing quality. It's important to note this is in part because of the terrible conditions of the public housing that they previously lived in. So anything would be an improvement in that context. But they also recognize that they're not developing sort of strong or deep or meaningful relationships with their neighbors. And they note this example of incorporated exclusion. Here, lower income residents are incorporated into the housing development by virtue of being residents, but they feel excluded in terms of their treatment, both from higher income neighbors, but also from, importantly, from the building management companies. Now, this gap between the theory and the empirical results, as I mentioned, raises lots of different questions. And the one I want to focus on is, what do we mean by mixed income housing? Way back when, in the late 1990s, housing policy analysts have declared that there's actually no accepted definition of mixed income housing. More recently, looking across the work that had been done in the previous years, 15 years, we haven't made a lot of progress. We've come to the conclusion that what counts as mixed income housing varies considerably. In prior work, what I've done with Larry is to think about some of the dimensions that characterize mixed income housing as a way to try to establish some sort of common ground. What we found is that a key dimension is allocation. Okay? And this has to do with the distribution of housing units by subsidy type. In the US context, we can think of this conventionally as the proportion of units that are public housing. Here, that might be social housing. The proportion of units that are considered affordable housing, these receive a shallow subsidy from moderate income households. And then the proportion of units that are set at market rent. These have no subsidy at all, and they're intended for households that can pay the going rate. The next dimension is proximity. And this refers to the spatial distribution of the subsidized and unsubsidized units. Proximity can occur at the building level. So we might have low-income residents in one building and higher-income residents in another building, but they live in the same project or in the same campus. Spatial separation may occur within the building, so that lower-income residents are on one floor and higher-income residents are on a separate floor. Or, of course, at the finest grain level, they can occur on the same floor, where households are simply separated by adjacent units. A third dimension is tenure, and this refers to the distribution of homeownership and rental units. Now, the prior work in literature suggests that this is suggests a sort of interesting dynamic here, where homeowners, because of their commitment and their investment in their homes, will also take greater commitment and investment in their communities and keeping neighborhoods well maintained. Whereas renters, by virtue of being transient, will not have that same level of concern. It's interesting to note that in the subsidized context, this is often flipped, right? Because if you're a low-income tenant, you need to stay in that unit in order to maintain your subsidy. So you may have a much greater tenure, a longer-term stay, 20 or 30 years, and a much deeper investment and commitment to your neighborhood than a higher-income resident who might leave because of a change in job or change in family composition. Similarly, for home ownership units, higher-income residents may use that as an investment property or seek to flip it in order to reap the gains from increased property values. The final dimension that we look at is duration, and this has to do with the time limits for housing subsidies. In the US context, public housing is considered to be a permanent subsidy. Of course, it's subject to congressional appropriations, but so far it's kept around. Whereas low-income housing tax credits and other types of subsidies have time limits and can expire within 15 or 20 years. Now, there's a lot of value in creating these dimensions, but now I want to be self-critical and highlight some of the concerns. The first is that this is exclusively based on US Hope 6 public housing redevelopment projects. This is data that we obtained from HUD and we're able to analyze. But of course, mixed income housing does not necessarily involve public housing in the US or elsewhere. And of course, there are also many forms of mixed income housing. In the US, we have low-income housing tax credits, which provide incentives and tax incentives to developers to include affordable units in their housing development projects. We have the Moving to Opportunity program, in which a treatment group was issued, low-income households were issued vouchers that could only be used in low-poverty neighborhoods. And of course, as we saw in the previous talk, there's inclusionary zoning and other programs. Another concern is that, for the most part, these dimensions all focus on project-level characteristics, but these overlook key considerations when we think about mixed-income housing. One is individual households, and then two is the larger neighborhood context. What I want to suggest today is that we've done a lot to focus on mixed-income housing. And I think the presentations that we've seen so far today and that we'll also see tomorrow suggest that we've made a lot of progress on this front. Certainly, as Sean and others have pointed out, there are a lot of challenges and it's very hard work. But in some ways, we've advanced in our thinking about how to build housing in which we can attach different subsidies and bring low-income households together to live with high-income households. What I would encourage us to do is to shift our attention to think about away from this static idea of mixed-income housing and to think about income mixing, which presents a set of deeper challenges. Now that we've brought those households together, what are the types of social interactions that they're having? What are the social outcomes, and how can we encourage or enhance or support the social benefits that we theorize? Under this conceptual framework, income mixing involves those four categories that I talked about. So one is the households. Are we talking about high-income households or low-income households? The dynamic process of moving. This can be very disruptive for some households. For others, it can be something that's voluntary. The housing characteristics themselves, this refers to those 4 dimensions that I mentioned earlier. And then there's the larger neighborhood context. Now, each of those topics raises its own series of questions. As I mentioned, for the households, we might ask, are we looking at extremely low-income households living with extremely high-income households, or is it somewhere in between? In terms of the moves, is it the high-income households who are being asked to move, or is it the lower-income households who are being asked to move, or what combination? Another key issue is, why are they being moved? Is it forced, or is it voluntary? Is this a function of displacement? The type of project that they're moving to refers to those dimensions of allocation, tenure, duration, and proximity. And then finally, in terms of neighborhoods, where are these households moving to? The shorthand, as I mentioned earlier, is who is moved where. And I think this tries to bring some of these ideas together, which I've outlined in sort of a diagram form, and I'll try to walk you through this in the time remaining. Here on your left, we're thinking about which households are moving. For the ease of exposition and for simplicity, I've just broken this into 2 categories, high and low income. But of course, we would actually want to think of this as a continuous spectrum. Across the top, you can see that we're looking at neighborhood moves. Are households moving from high-income neighborhoods to other high-income neighborhoods? Or are they moving from a high-income neighborhood to a low-income neighborhood? Similarly, we can think of whether households are moving from a low-income neighborhood to a higher-income neighborhood or to some other low-income neighborhood. And then you can see here in the framework, embedded within this are those project-level characteristics, the 4 dimensions I mentioned. This framework, I think, is useful in thinking through a series of problems. In particular, what housing policy the problems housing policy seeks to address, and some of the goals that it also tries to accomplish. For high-income households moving into high-income neighborhoods, the primary concern is around things like income segregation and exclusion. Right? Here we're worried about the creation of enclaves. The example in the US that's very common is gated communities, where it's very clear that low-income households, even if they could afford, are physically prevented from entering. For high-income households moving into low-income neighborhoods, the chief advantage of this approach is around neighborhood reinvestment. Higher-income households will bring increased spending, but also potentially raise property values, which will increase tax revenue. The disadvantage of this approach is concerns about gentrification and displacement, particularly for low-income households who may have been long-term residents who find that they're now priced out. For low-income households moving into high-income neighborhoods, one of the big benefits that's theorized and that there's some evidence for is access to opportunity and resources. These are things like higher quality schools, but also access to transit and employment opportunities in job centers. High-income households may be concerned about low-income households moving into these neighborhoods because of things like neighborhood tipping. If too many low-income households move in, the concern is that property values will decline and the neighborhoods won't be as desirable anymore. For low-income households, there might be a concern that moving into a high-income neighborhood means that their previous social ties are severed or cut, and it's much harder to reestablish those in those new neighborhoods. For low-income households moving to low-income neighborhoods, the key benefit there is that these strong sense of community that we've seen in previous literature, particularly around public housing complexes and projects. But of course, US housing policy has identified low-income households in low-income neighborhoods as being a primary concern for concentrated poverty and associated social problems, including crime and unemployment. I think this framework also helps us to think about some of these different approaches to income mixing and how we can organize some of these housing policies. High-income households moving into high-income neighborhoods is simply the operation of the private housing market. Although this may not be the result of any intentional or specific housing policy, I think it's important to note that it's clearly a result of the housing policies that we've created, and exclusion is part of the game. High-income households moving into low-income neighborhoods is, I think, in some ways a representation of the conventional view of public housing redevelopment under the Hope 6 program. And other work I show, and I'll present in a little bit, some reasons why that conventional view doesn't always hold. But this is the idea that public housing was located in isolated, economically declining areas to begin with, concentrating low-income households in those neighborhoods contributed in some ways to the economic decline. And so the idea was to figure out ways to redevelop housing to bring in or to lure higher income residents to live in those neighborhoods. Low-income households moving to high-income neighborhoods has been tried in a few cases. One is the Moving to Opportunity program, which I mentioned earlier. Low-income households in the treatment group were given vouchers that could only be used in neighborhoods where poverty levels were less than 10%. And this also can occur in the context of inclusionary zoning, when we see that in strong housing markets. Low-income households moving to low-income neighborhoods is in some ways the traditional operation of the public housing program in the United States because of the history of its siting and location, but also the housing voucher program, which is subject to rent limits and also landlord participation, which often translates into discrimination. That last cell that I mentioned in terms of conventional public housing, conventional views on Hope 6, I think are somewhat overturned by some of our previous work, looking at those 4 dimensions and the variety of mixed income housing developments that we see. I'll note a few examples here of Hope 6 redevelopment projects that actually don't all fall within that same category. Public housing redevelopment, in some cases, has explored this, but interestingly, it hasn't been studied quite so closely in some of these other cities. I'm getting close to time here, so I will wrap up. I want to note that I focused here on income, but in part that was just to sort of simplify things and to be able to explain this in a context that I think is very relevant. Not to mention that the name of this game is mixed income or income mixing, right? So income is clearly a focus. But we can clearly include other variables. We can think about race and racial composition, education levels, as well as employment and other characteristics. But the hope or the idea is that this framework will help predict and understand some of the variation and outcomes that we're seeing, because these outcomes don't just depend on the project level characteristics that so many of us in this room know about and are concerned about and we have some control over. They also have to do with these household characteristics, the dynamic process of moving and income mixing, as well as the larger neighborhood context. And finally, I just want to emphasize perhaps a shift in this thinking from the static role of mixed income housing, where we're thinking about housing or project level characteristics, to a more dynamic idea of how income mixing can occur and create some of the social benefits we're interested in. Thank you.